Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, into a medieval winter. Imagine the bite of frost on your cheeks, the relentless gray sky pressing down, and the ever-present threat of starvation nipping at your heels. The wind howls through the crudely thatched roofs of your village, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and, well, let's just say sanitation wasn't exactly a priority. You probably won't survive this, not in reality, but in our minds, we can. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always wild to think about the time difference and how we can all experience this story together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the knee-deep snow, each step a laborious effort. The sun, a pale ghost behind layers of clouds, offers little warmth. The year is 1347 and your village is just one tiny speck in a vast, frozen world. You pull your threadbare tunic tighter, but it offers scant protection against the wind that whips relentlessly across the open fields. You can feel the cold seeping into your bones, a constant, gnawing presence. Your breath plumes out in white clouds as you make your way towards the forest. Firewood is scarce, and without it, your family will face a long, brutal night. You probably think a simple Amazon delivery is coming to the rescue. Think again. The forest floor is a treacherous landscape of hidden roots and icy patches. One wrong step and you could be nursing a sprained ankle for weeks, a luxury you definitely can't afford. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly shorter than us, due to poor nutrition, but I think we're all safe in saying that a sprained ankle still wouldn't be fun, no matter your height. You finally reach a cluster of scraggly trees, their branches weighed down with snow. You start hacking away at a fallen branch with your dull axe, the rhythmic thud echoing through the silent woods. The effort warms you slightly, but the sweat quickly turns cold and clammy against your skin. As you work, you glance nervously around. The forest holds dangers beyond the cold: wolves, bandits, and the ever-present fear of the unknown. Superstition runs deep in these times. Some folks in your village believe that spirits roam the woods, especially during the darkest days of winter. One quirky but widely believed folk story involved leaving offerings of bread and milk out for woodland fairies to appease them and ensure a good harvest in the spring. You are not sure if you buy into it, but you are in no position to ignore the lore. You manage to gather a decent load of firewood and begin the slow trek back to the village. As you approach, you see smoke rising from the chimneys of the few houses huddled together for warmth. The village is your life, your haven, and your prison. Back in your cramped, one-room house, your family huddles around a meager fire. Your wife, her face etched with worry, stirs a pot of thin stew. It's mostly water and a few scraps of vegetables, barely enough to stave off hunger. Your children, their faces pale and gaunt, stare silently into the flames. They're old enough to understand the severity of the winter, but too young to help. It's a grim sight and you know something has to change. Speaking of things that need to change. Did you know that the average medieval peasant consumed roughly 3,000 calories a day, believe it or not? It sounds like a lot, especially given the image of constant starvation, but those calories were mostly from bread and ale, the staples of the medieval diet. It's a testament to the sheer physical labor they endured. You're not really consuming bread at this moment, but at least the warmth is bringing some happiness. The lack of food is a constant worry. The crops failed last summer, and the livestock are dwindling. Hunting is difficult, and fishing is impossible in the frozen rivers. The cold has a way of magnifying every problem, every hardship. And you find yourself wishing you could go back to the days where Amazon could solve your hunger problems, but this is your reality. Outside, the wind howls, rattling the flimsy walls of your house. You can hear the wolves howling in the distance, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk beyond the village. You pull your children closer, offering what little comfort you can. You tell them stories, tales of brave knights and magical creatures, anything to distract them from the cold and the hunger. You just hope they don't start craving that mythical creature. As the night wears on, the fire slowly dwindles. The cold seeps back into the house, a relentless tide. You wrap yourselves in layers of blankets, but it's not enough. Sleep comes fitfully, punctuated by the sounds of the wind and the wolves. Did you know that the medieval period actually saw a little ice age? Historians pinpoint its start around the 14th century, and its effects were felt throughout Europe, bringing about colder winters, shorter growing seasons, and widespread famine. Some scholars theorize that volcanic activity may have played a significant role in triggering this climate shift. The winter seems endless, a relentless cycle of cold, hunger, and fear. But you persevere. You have to. You have a family to protect, a village to support. You are a medieval peasant, and you are resilient. You may not have much, but you have your community, your faith, and your will to survive. And let's be honest, even though it's miserable, there's a certain stark beauty to it all. The snow-covered landscape, the crackling fire, the shared warmth of your family. These are the things that keep you going, the things that make life worth living, even in the darkest of times. There's a weird custom you had heard from a passing trader the previous summer. In some remote villages, they would elect a winter king or queen for a brief period during the deepest part of winter. This person would be treated with mock royalty, given special privileges, and then, at the end of their reign, would be symbolically dethroned, representing the eventual end of winter's grip. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine folk custom or simply an exaggeration in later accounts. You, however, are more worried about just trying to stay afloat than the next king or queen. You huddle closer to the fire as you and your family slowly doze off for the night, ready to face another day tomorrow. You trudge. Yes, you. Not some king, not some knight in shining armor, but you, dear viewer, as a peasant. And not a particularly successful peasant, mind you. More like the kind of peasant who makes other peasants say, well, at least I'm not that guy/gal. The mud sucks at your worn leather boots, clinging like a lovesick badger. Overhead, the sky is the color of a bruised plum, threatening rain. Or worse, snow. Oh, the joy. Before you, nestled in the lee of a rather pathetic-looking hill, sits your home. And I use the word home with the same level of enthusiasm one might use when describing a particularly unpleasant rash. It's a wattle-and-daub construction, meaning it's basically sticks and mud held together by sheer willpower and the faint hope that the roof won't collapse during the next good breeze. Think of it as medieval DIY, but with significantly less doing and a whole lot more why, oh why, did I think this was a good idea? The front door, if you can call a rough-hewn plank of wood loosely attached to the frame a door, hangs askew. You push it open with a sigh that could wilt a particularly stubborn dandelion. Inside, it's not winning any interior design awards, let's put it that way. One room. That's it. All your worldly possessions, which, admittedly, don't amount to much more than a few tattered clothes, a chipped wooden bowl, and a persistent sense of existential dread, are crammed into this one space. The floor is packed earth, which, surprisingly, is colder than the mud outside. A fire pit sits in the center of the room, radiating a pathetic amount of heat and a truly impressive amount of smoke. It's a marvel you haven't choked to death yet. You feed it a few meager scraps of wood, coaxing a tiny flicker of flame to life. Maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to stave off hypothermia for another night. Hope springs eternal, even in the face of abject poverty. Speaking of which, poverty was a major driver of the feudal system. Peasants like you were tied to the land, obligated to work for the lord in exchange for protection and a small plot of land to eke out a living. It wasn't exactly a fair trade, but hey, at least you weren't being pillaged by Vikings. Small mercies, right? You see a small movement in the corner of the room. It's your roommate, a rather plump field mouse named Mortimer. He eyes you warily, whiskers twitching. You glare back. Sharing your already meager rations with a rodent wasn't exactly on your bucket list. Don't even think about it, Mortimer, you mutter. He seems to understand, or at least he pretends to. Mortimer is surprisingly good at pretending. The insulation, as you may have gathered, is non-existent. Drafts snake through the cracks in the walls, carrying the chill of the outside world with them. You pull your threadbare blanket tighter around your shoulders, shivering. It's not exactly a down comforter, but it's better than nothing. Well, almost. You often wonder if nothing wouldn't be warmer. Fun fact, people in medieval Europe rarely bathed. Like, rarely. We're talking once a year, maybe, if you were feeling particularly festive. Which, given your current circumstances, you definitely are not. Historians still argue whether this was due to a lack of hygiene knowledge or a genuine aversion to water. My personal theory? They just couldn't be bothered. I mean, who can blame them? Dragging water from the well in the dead of winter just to freeze your bits off. No, thank you. You remember the last time you bathed. It was in the nearby stream, and it was so cold that you swear you saw your own teeth chattering. The experience was less refreshing and more near-death. You quickly learned that the stream had other purposes, disposing of waste, doing laundry. Now you stay away from it. You rummage around in your meager belongings, searching for something to eat. You find a few stale chunks of bread and a handful of dried beans. Not exactly a gourmet meal, but it's food. You soak the beans in a bit of water, hoping to soften them up enough to chew. Then, like a gourmet chef, you sprinkle the bread with dirt. Yum! Another delightful tidbit, medieval peasants often ate with their hands. Forks were considered a bit fancy. And since you're living in a one-room hut, being fancy is way out of your reach. Also, utensils would require washing, and remember your stream excursion? No thanks. As you eat your delightful meal, you cast your gaze out the small window. It's not really a window per se, but a hole in the wall covered with a thin piece of oiled parchment. It offers a blurry view of the outside world. A few chickens peck around in the yard, oblivious to your existential angst. You envy them. At least they have feathers. The chickens remind you of your duties. Tomorrow you'll have to work in the Lord's fields, planting crops or harvesting whatever happens to be in season. It's back-breaking work, but you have no choice. If you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, you die. It's a simple equation, really. Scholars debate about how much time peasants actually spent working for the Lord. Some argue that it was a relatively small amount, while others claim that it consumed the vast majority of their time. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in the middle. The key is to be on your best behavior because the Lord's nights are scary. You sigh again, a long, weary sound that seems to echo the despair of generations of peasants. You crawl onto your straw-filled mattress, pulling the blanket over your head. It smells faintly of mildew and mortimer, but you try not to think about it. You close your eyes, attempting to drift off to sleep. Sleep, however, proves elusive. The cold gnaws at your bones, the smoke stings your eyes, and the ever-present fear of starvation keeps you tossing and turning. You hear the wind howling outside, rattling the walls of your rickety home. You wonder if it will survive the night. Then there's the sounds. The squeaks of the mice, the rustling of the straw, the distant barking of dogs. You also hear the occasional groan of the wooden structure, sounding like the complaints of a disgruntled old man. You start to think your house has a personality. One particularly odd thing you remember learning is that some medieval peasants believed in fairies and other mythical creatures. They would leave out offerings of food and drink in the hopes of appeasing these beings and warding off bad luck. You briefly consider leaving out a chunk of bread for the fairies, but then you remember that you're already sharing your rations with Mortimer. Fairies are just going to have to find their own snacks. Then you start to think, well, maybe you should leave food for the fairies. Maybe, if you appease them, they'll bring you some luck. Maybe they'll lead you to a hidden treasure, or maybe they'll just stop the roof from leaking. You chuckle softly to yourself, the sound swallowed by the darkness. You finally drift off to sleep, plagued by dreams of endless fields, demanding lords, and ravenous mice. Tomorrow will be another day, another struggle. But for now, you are asleep. For now, you don't have to be a peasant. But now it's time to wake up. The sun, a weak and watery thing, is barely peeking over the horizon. The mud is slightly less frozen. The chickens are clucking. And Mortimer is giving you that look again. And, as the saying goes, the world doesn't sleep, especially not when you have planting to do. Alright, settle in, buttercups. Let's talk threads. Or, well, the lack thereof. You trudge through the pre-dawn mist, the chill seeping into your bones despite the layers you think you're wearing. Layer up, medieval peasant clothing. More like layer on whatever you can find. You're not exactly rocking haute couture here. Think, potato sack chic, but make it itchy. The year is, let's say, 1348. A delightful time to be alive, really. Unless, you catch the plague. Or starve. Or get conscripted into some lord's army to fight over a field of turnips. But hey, at least you've got clothing. Your innermost layer, if you're lucky, is a linen shirt. Linen, made from flax, was relatively cheap and easy to produce. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of your favorite worn-out band t-shirt, only less comfortable and probably harboring more unidentified life forms. It's scratchy, damp, and probably smells faintly of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. Ah, the scent of peasantry. Don't expect daily changes, either. Washing clothes was a whole thing back then. It involved beating your clothes against rocks, and hoping a passing goat didn't decide to add its own special fragrance to the mix. Over that, you might have a tunic. A simple, shapeless garment, usually made of wool. Wool, while warmer than linen, is also, well, woolly. Imagine wearing a slightly damp sheep. Not a pleasant thought, is it? The color? Earth tones, darling. Think browns, grays, the occasional muddy green. No vibrant pinks or electric blues for you. Dyes were expensive and reserved for the upper crust. You're aiming for blending into the scenery, not attracting the attention of any roving brigands. Historians still argue whether bright colors were entirely unavailable, or simply unaffordable for the peasant class. I mean, maybe there was that one cool peasant with a naturally purple turnip patch that went rogue. Now, about those layers providing scant warmth. That's not just poetic license. Medieval houses were notoriously drafty. We're talking holes in the walls, thatched roofs that leaked, and a general absence of anything resembling insulation. The good old days weren't so good when you're shivering your way through December. Your best bet for staying warm was huddling around the fire, which meant smelling even more like wood smoke. And don't forget your legs. You're probably wearing hose, which are essentially wool socks that go up to your thighs. Imagine wool socks that haven't been washed in weeks, and might have some interesting company living in them. I'm talking about lice, of course. Did you know that lice were so common, people had specialized combs to remove them? It was practically a medieval grooming ritual. Honey, have you deliced the kids yet? So romantic. On your feet, you've got shoes. Simple leather shoes, usually made of a single piece of leather wrapped around your foot and tied with a leather thong. Think moccasins, but less comfortable and more likely to fall apart when you're chasing after a runaway pig. And remember, no socks with sandals here, unless you're aiming for a truly horrific fashion statement. For women, the clothing was similar, but with a few key differences. Instead of a tunic, you'd likely wear a kirtle, which is a long, fitted dress. Over that, you might wear a surcoat, which is essentially a sleeveless tunic worn over the kirtle. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a vest, but longer and less likely to be made of denim. And, of course, a head covering of some sort. A simple linen cap or a wimple, which is a cloth that covers the head and neck. Hair was generally considered scandalous to display, unless, of course, you were a queen or some other high-ranking noble. But let's be honest, if you were royalty, you wouldn't be reading this. You'd be busy ordering someone to fetch you another goblet of wine. Now, let's talk accessories. Or, again, the lack thereof. Jewelry was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. The most you might have is a simple wooden or bone pendant. Maybe a small leather pouch to carry your few precious belongings. A knife, for cutting bread, or maybe, deterring unwanted advances. Survival skills, my dears. Speaking of survival, let's not forget the impact of clothing on your actual well-being. In the medieval world, your clothing wasn't just about fashion, or the lack thereof. It was about protection. Protection from the elements, protection from injury, and even protection from social ostracism. Walking around half-naked wasn't exactly a recipe for success. And remember, everything was handmade. No fast fashion here. Every stitch was sewn by hand, every piece of cloth woven on a loom. It was a labor-intensive process, which meant clothing was valuable. You didn't just toss something out because it had a small tear. You patched it, you mended it, you wore it until it literally fell apart. Upcycling before upcycling was cool. You noticed the sunrise bleeding into the horizon, turning the gray sky to a pinkish hue. Your breath hangs in the air like tiny clouds. And even though you're cold, and your clothes are itchy, and you're pretty sure you have a family of lice living in your hose, there's a certain authenticity to it all. You're connected to a simpler time, a time when people lived closer to the land, and closer to each other. A time when a simple linen shirt was a treasured possession. A time before polyester. Thank goodness. A fringe, and somewhat macabre, tidbit, clothes sometimes carried the plague. Fleas carrying the deadly bacteria could burrow into the fabric, spreading the disease. So, that hand-me-down tunic from your recently deceased uncle? Possibly cursed. Fun, right? As the sun climbs higher, casting long shadows across the fields, you spot another figure in the distance. A fellow peasant, trudging along the same path. You nod in acknowledgement, a silent understanding passing between you. You're both wearing roughly the same thing, enduring the same hardships. But you're also both alive, and that's something to be grateful for. Did you know that the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was around 30 years? Makes you appreciate your modern existence, doesn't it? Historians still argue about the exact extent of social mobility in medieval society. Could a peasant really rise through the ranks and become a knight? Or were you essentially stuck in the social class you were born into? The answer, as with most things in history, is probably somewhere in between. While it was certainly difficult to climb the social ladder, it wasn't entirely impossible. Cleverness, luck, and a strong dose of ruthlessness could sometimes get you ahead. But, of course, changing your clothes might have made it easier to assume a new social standing. Dress the part, and all that. Now, you continue your walk, the rough wool of your tunic scratching against your skin. But you push on, knowing that there's work to be done. Fields to be plowed, crops to be harvested, lords to be appeased. It's a tough life, but it's your life. And at least you're dressed for it. Kind of. You see, it really is all relative. At least you're not naked. I swear that's a joke. Light one. I need more caffeine. And remember, folks, next time you're complaining about your wardrobe, just think about the medieval peasant. Be grateful for your soft cotton t-shirts, your comfortable jeans, and your ability to change your clothes every day. You've got it pretty good, all things considered. And, if you ever find yourself transported back to the 14th century, at least you'll have a basic understanding of what to wear. Or, more accurately, what to find to wear. Now get out there and make the most of your non-plague-ridden, fashion-forward lives. You huddle closer to the fire, feeling the immediate warmth lick at your exposed skin. That's it, isn't it? That primal instinct kicking in, a response hardwired over millennia. See fire, seek warmth. Simple. Elegant, even. But let's be real, elegant until your backside freezes while your face melts. Such is the dilemma of fire's flicker. The heat is localized, to say the least. A few feet away, winter is still very much a thing. You shuffle a bit, rotating like a seasoned rotisserie chicken, trying to achieve an even cook. One side, then the other. Ooh, maybe you should start basting yourself. You know, it's funny, we romanticize fires so much. Think about it, campfires, fireplaces, candles, so cozy, right? Well, try actually relying on it for survival. See how romantic it feels when your teeth are chattering and you're spending half the night feeding the darn thing. It loses its charm rather quickly. Speaking of survival, did you know that controlling fire is considered one of the most pivotal moments in human history? No kidding, right? It was like, bam, suddenly cooked food, protection from predators, a light in the darkness, and, you know, a slightly less raw diet. Suddenly, saber-toothed tigers are just a furry nuisance. Historians still argue whether Homo erectus or an earlier hominin species first mastered fire. Some evidence points to controlled burns in South Africa almost 2 million years ago. I mean, that's, like, before sliced bread. Which, by the way, speaking of bread, imagine having to cook bread over this fire. Talk about a burnt offering. And then there's that whole thing about fire supposedly helping our brains grow, because cooked food is easier to digest and delivers more calories, freeing up energy for bigger thoughts. I wonder if that's why I'm still thinking about whether to put another log on the fire or move slightly closer and risk spontaneous combustion. But hey, at least you're not freezing to death in the dark. Silver linings, right? You poke at the embers with a stick, sending a shower of sparks dancing upwards. It's mesmerizing, isn't it? The way they disappear, as ephemeral as a TikTok trend. I'm sure even our ancestors were just as mesmerized, even if they didn't have social media to document it. You add another piece of wood, a hefty log that sighs and crackles as the flames greedily embrace it. The warmth intensifies, pushing back against the encroaching cold. You almost feel comfortable. Almost. Now, here's something a little weird for you. Some cultures believed that fire held a spiritual power, a direct link to the gods. They even had fire priests and priestesses whose sole job was to tend to the sacred flame. Imagine having that as your job description, professional fire tender. Sounds like a really niche Tinder profile. And talking about spiritual power, a fringe theory suggests that early humans actually worshipped fire, viewing it as a sentient being. Kind of like a Tamagotchi, but instead of feeding it virtual pixels, you feed it actual wood. You'd probably have to clean up after it too. Probably. Historians still argue whether fire worship was a widespread phenomenon or merely a localized practice. Regardless, it's a testament to the profound impact fire had on our ancestors' lives. I mean, it's hard to be a fire worshipper when your face is being roasted, but hey, to each their own. You stretch out your hands, feeling the heat seep into your stiff fingers. The firelight flickers across your face, casting dancing shadows. You watch the flames, their hypnotic dance drawing you in. It's easy to get lost in their movements, to forget about the biting cold just outside the circle of light. It's also easy to forget about the fact that you can only cook a small amount of food at one time. No wonder our ancestors got so skinny, you'd starve trying to cook for the whole family. Even a simple pot of stew probably took hours, babysitting the fire and hoping it didn't burn down your entire cave. Which, by the way, caves. Cozy, right? Unless you're trying to get a decent Wi-Fi signal. You wouldn't believe the drop-off just outside this firelight. But back to the warmth, such as it is. You shift again, rotating like a slightly less crispy rotisserie chicken. You're pretty sure you're developing a farmer's tan on your face now. And here's a historical fact that might make you feel a little better about your current situation: the invention of the chimney was a game changer. Before that, smoke inhalation was a major issue, leading to respiratory problems and even death. Yeah, Imagine trying to relax by the fire when you're constantly coughing and choking. Not exactly the picture of cozy domesticity, is it? You know, I wonder if the phrase, "where there's smoke, there's fire," actually came from that period. Seems like a pretty self-evident statement at that point. Some fringe historians even argue that poor air quality due to smoky fires contributed to cognitive decline in some populations. Basically, your brain was slowly being pickled by the smoke. Maybe that explains some of the questionable decisions we make today. Like, I dunno, getting a perm. Historians still argue whether the long-term health effects of early fire practices significantly impacted population growth. But it's safe to say that breathing clean air is generally a good thing. And right now, you're probably breathing a whole lot of smoke. Delicious. You cough lightly, clearing your throat. Time to adjust your position again. You lean back against a nearby rock, trying to find a comfortable spot. The rock is cold, but at least it provides some support. Ah, the luxuries of cave living. The fire crackles merrily, oblivious to your discomfort. It's just doing its thing, consuming wood and radiating heat. You almost envy its simplicity. No worries about taxes, no deadlines, just pure, unadulterated combustion. Now here's a slightly lighter historical tidbit: fire has been used for signaling since ancient times. Smoke signals were used by various cultures to communicate over long distances. Think of it as the prehistoric equivalent of texting. Except instead of emojis, you were just sending up puffs of smoke. Maybe you should try sending one now. A little puff of smoke asking for pizza delivery. Probably won't work, but hey, you never know. Some fringe theorists believe that the complexity of early smoke signaling systems has been drastically underestimated. They propose that intricate codes and nuanced messages were conveyed through variations in smoke density and patterns. I'm picturing a whole smoke signal Morse code here. Historians still argue whether smoke signals were a truly effective form of long-distance communication. It's hard to imagine conducting a complex negotiation via smoke puffs, but I guess if you're bored enough, you'll find something to argue about. You watch the flames dance, listening to the crackling and popping of the wood. It's a soothing sound, despite the slightly uneven heating you're currently experiencing. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the warmth wash over you. It's not perfect, but it's enough. For now. Plus, you know, you could be in a way worse situation. Think of the people who couldn't control fire at all, shivering in the dark, gnawing on raw mammoth meat. At least you have cooked food and a fighting chance against the elements. Well, one of the elements anyway. Okay, who am I kidding? This sucks. You really need to find a better way to keep warm. Maybe you should invent a blanket. Or a sweater. Or even just a really big, furry animal to snuggle with. Now that's a thought. Alright, settle in, buttercups. Let's talk winter survival, food edition. That icy wind howling outside. Yeah, that's your stomach rumbling in sympathy with the barren landscape. Forget those idyllic snow-dusted Christmas card scenes for a hot minute. We're diving into the gnawing reality of keeping yourself, and maybe a whole community, alive when the pantry's looking emptier than a politician's promises. You trudge through the snow, the crunch under your worn boots a constant reminder of the frozen world around you. The air bites at your exposed skin, and each breath plumes out in a frosty cloud. You're not just taking a leisurely winter stroll, you're on a mission, a desperate hunt for, well, anything edible. Think of it less as foraging and more as culinary archaeology. You're sifting through nature's leftovers, hoping to unearth a forgotten treasure. A few withered berries clinging stubbornly to a branch, the promise of a bitter but vital snack. Maybe you'll find some hardy roots that burrow deep to avoid the killing frost. These are going to be less delicious, and more, tastes like dirt you'd eat if you were really, really hungry. Consider yourself a truffle pig, only the truffles are slightly frozen tubers and your pay is not dying from scurvy. Remember that time, way back in fall, when you were all, "Oh, I'll get to that squash later." Later is now, my friend. And that squash, if it's still remotely intact and not a furry science experiment, is about to become the MVP of your diet. The cornerstone of winter survival, back in the day, was really foresight. Preparation. Think squirrel-level dedication to stashing away acorns, but for humans, and hopefully with a slightly better sense of interior design for your larder. I mean, a squirrel's nest is fine for a squirrel, but you ideally want something slightly less twiggy. Historically, preserving food was an art form. It wasn't just about chucking things in a root cellar and hoping for the best. It was a careful process, often involving salting, smoking, drying, or pickling. The Vikings, famously, were big fans of fermented fish. I'm told that the pungent aroma could peel paint, so perhaps your modern fridge is something you should not take for granted. Imagine your leftovers were not the object of silent internal debate, but instead, actively waging chemical warfare on your nostrils. Speaking of the Vikings, here's a slightly less mainstream fact: they apparently used something called skyr, a sort of Icelandic yogurt, to preserve meat. You'd pack the meat in skyr, and the acidity would help prevent spoilage. Who needs refrigeration when you have ancient fermented dairy wizardry? Historians still argue whether fermented shark, hakarl, served during the midwinter feasts of the old sagas, was a delicious treat or just a way to assert dominance over weaker stomachs. I mean, sure, you could ferment your shark in the snow for several weeks until it smells strongly of ammonia, but should you? That's the question. And let's be honest, winter food wasn't exactly gourmet dining. It was about sustenance. It was about calories. It was about not starving. Flavor was often a distant second, third, or even 27th priority. Think of it as rustic. Extra rustic. So rustic it makes burlap look like silk. Now, you're back inside the relative warmth of your home. The fire crackles merrily in the hearth, offering a small pocket of comfort against the encroaching cold. You carefully inspect your meager haul: a handful of berries, a few scraggly roots, and that slightly questionable squash. Time to get creative. Let's talk root cellars. These underground havens were the medieval equivalent of your modern refrigerator. The Earth's constant temperature helped keep food from freezing solid or rotting away. You'd store everything down there: potatoes, turnips, carrots, apples, and of course, the ever-present squash. It's important that the cellar is dark. You don't want to encourage any premature sprouting. Unless you're into that root cellar chic look. Which, let's face it, is probably not a thing. Interestingly enough, some cultures used, and still use, ice houses, insulated structures built to store ice harvested from frozen lakes and rivers. This ice could be used to keep perishable foods cool throughout the warmer months. You're basically building a giant, extremely inefficient, and utterly delightful refrigerator. Historians still argue whether the use of ice houses was a widespread practice or something only the truly wealthy could afford. Imagine trying to explain the concept of an ice house to someone today. So, you see, we cut huge blocks of ice, hauled them inside, and then waited for them to melt very, very slowly. Sounds kind of mad when you say it aloud, right? But what if you didn't have a root cellar or an ice house? What if you were just, a regular person trying to survive? Well, that's when things got really interesting. And by interesting, I mean involving a lot of weird ingredients and questionable cooking techniques. Think about it: you're limited to dried beans, salted meat, and whatever else you manage to squirrel away, no pun intended. Variety is definitely not the spice of life at this point. You're basically living off a beige-toned diet, occasionally punctuated by the exciting discovery of a slightly less brown vegetable. During the leanest times, people would often supplement their diets with whatever they could find. Bark flour, made from the inner bark of trees, could be added to bread to stretch out the supply. It wasn't particularly nutritious or delicious, but it filled a void. Some areas even ground up bones for extra protein and minerals. Resourceful? Absolutely. Appetizing? Debatable. Fringe tidbit time: apparently, some cultures believed that eating clay could help with nutrient absorption and even ward off illness. Historians still argue whether this practice, known as geophagy, was actually beneficial or just a desperate measure driven by hunger and superstition. Either way, I don't recommend adding clay smoothie to your winter menu. And while we are on the topic of desperation, have you ever tried making stone soup? You boil water, drop in a clean stone, and then encourage everyone to contribute a little something from their own meager supplies. It's a great way to trick a village into sharing their food with you. I kid. It's more of a community-building exercise disguised as a culinary innovation. So, as you huddle by the fire, sipping your broth made from whatever bits and bobs you could find, remember that you are part of a long and fascinating history of human resilience. You are a survivor. You are a beige food enthusiast. And hey, at least you're not eating fermented shark. Yet. Remember to check back in for our next survival tip, how to make a fashion statement with your fur trappings. Okay, settle in, friend. Let's talk about animals. Specifically, the four-legged, bleating, oinking, mooing kind that are, like, super important when you're trying not to starve during a particularly enthusiastic medieval winter. Seriously, imagine ordering takeout in 1348. Not great options. So, you trudge through the snow, and it's the kind of snow that gets everywhere. Down your boots, up your sleeves, probably even in your beard if you're rocking the whole Viking aesthetic. But you're not thinking about your rapidly decreasing core temperature, you're thinking about Bessie, the cow who gives just enough milk to keep your kids from looking like tiny, malnourished goblins. You're thinking about Gertrude, the pig who's promised you a nice hem come Yuletide. And let's be honest, you're thinking about Gerald, the rooster whose crowing is only marginally less annoying than your mother-in-law, but who also provides a vital wake-up service, and occasionally a Sunday roast if he really pushes his luck. Protecting these guys isn't just some cute animal welfare thing. It's literally the difference between surviving the winter and, well, not surviving the winter. Let's be real, a frozen cow isn't exactly edible. It's more like a very large, very solid ice sculpture that smells faintly of manure. Trust me, you want the living cow. Now, what does protection look like? It's not like you can just pop down to the local farm supply store and grab a heated blanket and a set of tiny snow boots for each individual sheep. Though, wouldn't that be adorable? Imagine a little sheep in tiny Uggs. Instead, you're probably reinforcing the walls of the barn, stuffing every crack and crevice with straw and whatever rags you can find. It's all about minimizing drafts. Think of it like medieval weather stripping. You're basically becoming a professional insulator, only your tools are a pitchfork and a healthy dose of desperation. Inside, you're packing the animals together. Body heat is a real thing. It's like a giant, furry, snorting, mooing, communal heater. Cozy. Until someone cuts the cheese, that is. Then it's a whole other kind of communal experience. Feeding time is also crucial. You've, hopefully, been storing hay and grain all summer and autumn, and now you're doling it out. It's important stuff, not just for their survival but also for their production. A well-fed cow gives more milk, a well-fed pig gets fatter, and a well-fed rooster, probably crows louder. But still important. Here's a fun fact, in many medieval villages, animals weren't just kept in barns. Sometimes, they actually lived in the same house as the family. I know, sounds a bit fragrant. But think about it, it's one less structure to heat, and the animals provide some extra warmth. Plus, you always have a snack nearby, just kidding. Mostly. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or more of a last resort scenario. I, for one, am eternally grateful for modern plumbing. But beyond the physical protection, there's a whole layer of anxiety. Disease can wipe out an entire herd or flock in a matter of days. And in a world without antibiotics or even a decent understanding of germ theory, that's a terrifying prospect. You're relying on folk remedies, superstition, and a lot of desperate prayers. You might try bleeding a sick animal, because, well, nobody really knew why that was supposed to work, but it felt like something. You might burn herbs to ward off evil spirits, because obviously, the plague is just a grumpy ghost with a vendetta against livestock. You might even sacrifice a chicken to, well, to whatever deity you think might be listening. Desperate times, desperate measures, right? Speaking of superstitions, did you know that some people believe that burying a live frog under the threshold of the barn would protect the animals from disease? I mean, poor frog. But hey, at least he's helping, right? Sort of. Okay, not really. But I'm sure the logic made sense to someone at the time. Probably someone who'd been drinking a lot of medieval ale. And then there's the predators. Wolves, foxes, even the occasional hungry bear could pose a threat to your livestock. So you're constantly on guard, patrolling the perimeter of your property, armed with whatever pointy stick you can find. You might have a dog, which is great, unless the dog decides that the sheep look suspiciously like giant, fluffy chew toys. Then you've got a whole other problem. The medieval landscape, in many ways, revolved around the rhythms of animal husbandry. It shaped the layout of villages, the division of labor, and even the legal system. For example, in some parts of medieval Europe, laws were enacted to protect livestock from theft and poaching. Penalties could be severe, ranging from fines to imprisonment, and in some cases, even death. Stealing a cow was not a minor offense. It was like stealing someone's livelihood, their future, their potential Sunday roast. And it's not just about the practicalities of keeping animals alive. It's also about the emotional connection. These animals weren't just commodities. They were part of the family, in a weird, four-legged, occasionally smelly way. You knew their individual personalities, their quirks, their moody-s. Sorry, couldn't resist. Losing an animal to the cold or to disease wasn't just a financial blow. It was a personal loss. It was a reminder of the harsh realities of peasant life, the constant struggle against the elements, the ever-present threat of starvation. It's a somber fact that, even today, the economic precarity of subsistence farmers can lead to profound grief and despair when natural disaster, illness, or theft threaten the animals they depend on. But even in the midst of all the hardship, there was also a sense of hope. The spring would come eventually. The snow would melt. The animals would give birth to new generations. And the cycle of life would continue. It was a resilience born of necessity, a quiet determination to survive against all odds. And that's the thing about protecting livestock in the medieval period. It wasn't just about keeping animals alive. It was about keeping hope alive. It was about ensuring the survival of your family, your community, and your way of life. It was about facing the winter with grit, ingenuity, and a whole lot of, well, let's just say, a unique aroma. So, the next time you're curled up in your warm house, with a full fridge and a thermostat set to a balmy 72 degrees, take a moment to appreciate the hard work and dedication of those medieval peasants who braved the cold to protect their animals. Because without them, we might not be here today. And that would be a real, utter disaster. I know, I'll see myself out. You trudge through the knee-deep snow, the biting wind sculpting your cheeks into a rosy, frozen mask. Each breath plumes out in a cloud, a brief, ethereal sculpture dissolving into the gray expanse. This isn't some picturesque holiday card scene, no, this is survival, baby. Winter in the pre-industrial village is no joke. Forget cocoa and carols, it's more like chapped lips and constant chill. You're pulling a small sled laden with firewood, scavenged from the edges of the forest. The wood groans under its own weight, mirroring your aching muscles. You can practically feel the disapproving stares of every snow-covered tree you pass. Sorry, trees, you mutter, gotta keep the toesies warm. The village comes into view, a cluster of huddled houses nestled against the landscape like scared sheep. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, promising warmth and, well, hopefully, not too much soot inhalation. You can smell it already, that distinctive smoky odor that clings to everything in winter, a fragrance that is both comforting and vaguely carcinogenic. As you approach the first house, you hear the rhythmic thump of a hammer. Someone's patching up a roof, a never-ending battle against the elements. You wonder if they ever considered just moving south. Probably not an option back then, though. You pass the communal oven, a beehive-shaped structure usually bustling with activity. Today, it's quiet, the embers banked low. Bread making will have to wait until tomorrow. Supplies are dwindling. You heard Old Man Hemlock grumble this morning that his turnip patch yielded a particularly unimpressive crop this year. Turns out, even vegetables have bad days. You smile to yourself. You know, for a second there, you thought you heard someone mention climate change, but nah, probably just a coincidence. You reach your own cottage, a small, one-room affair shared with your, well, let's just say a robust family. Personal space is a luxury you can't afford, but hey, body heat is free, right? You wrestle the sled to a halt, your fingers stiff and numb despite your mittens. You almost wish you were one of those medieval hermits who lived in caves and ate only berries. Almost. Probably better to have a family that eats all your berries, you think. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of stew and damp wool. A fire crackles in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Your mother looks up from her spinning wheel, her face etched with a familiar blend of weariness and love. "Ah, you're back," she says, her voice raspy. "Did you find enough?" You nod, gesturing to the sled. "Enough to keep us from freezing, at least." Your younger siblings swarm you, their faces lit with the reflected glow of the fire. They grab at the firewood, their small hands surprisingly strong. Even the smallest amongst them is helping, stacking the wood with surprising diligence. It's a good thing they're all so helpful, or else you may start believing in reincarnation to come back as a slightly less loved child. This is the heart of it, isn't it? The community. The shared hardship, the shared survival. Everyone pitches in. The miller shares his flour, even when his own stores are low. The blacksmith sharpens tools for everyone, regardless of payment. The healer uses her knowledge of herbs to mend the sick, asking only for a helping hand in return. It's a barter system built on necessity and trust. You know it's not perfect, but it's something. Historians still argue whether this sense of communal responsibility was born out of altruism or simple self-preservation. Maybe it was a bit of both. Who knows? Either way, it worked. It allowed these small villages to endure, to weather the storms, both literal and metaphorical. One mainstream historical fact, by the way, is that the medieval open field system was designed to ensure everyone had access to land, fostering cooperation. Speaking of working, your father enters, wiping his brow. You're just in time. We need to help Farmer Giles with his barn roof. The snow's threatening to collapse it. You groan inwardly. More physical labor. But you know you have to go. If Farmer Giles' barn collapses, it affects everyone. His livestock provides milk and meat for the village. Besides, you had heard some rumors about his daughter. Now there's a thought that keeps your blood flowing. As you head out into the cold again, you notice Mrs. Abernathy, the village busybody, walking down the lane. She's wearing what looks suspiciously like a fox stole, even though foxes haven't been seen around here for donkey's years. Turns out that Mrs. Abernathy is actually a fox. Or at least, maybe she is. Fringe theory alert, some believe that certain individuals in medieval villages possessed the ability to shapeshift. Ahem, maybe. You know, like turning into foxes. Or maybe she's just very good at finding fur scraps. Working on Farmer Giles' barn is backbreaking. The wind whips around you, stinging your eyes. Your hands are raw and blistered. But you work alongside your neighbors, a collective grunt and heave echoing across the snowy fields. Someone cracks a joke about Farmer Giles' prize-winning pig, and everyone laughs, the sound strangely comforting in the desolate landscape. The joke, by the way, was about how the pig had a better social life than most of us. Pretty accurate, to be honest. As the sun begins to set, casting long, purple shadows across the snow, the barn roof is finally secured. Exhausted but satisfied, you gather with the others for a meager supper of bread and cheese, shared in the flickering lamplight. The air is filled with the murmur of conversation, the clinking of mugs, the sense of shared accomplishment. You hear stories of hardship, of loss, of near starvation. But you also hear stories of resilience, of kindness, of unwavering hope. These are the stories that bind the community together, the threads that weave a tapestry of survival. Later, curled up by the fire with your family, you feel a sense of, what? Contentment? Perhaps. Gratitude? Definitely. You're not rich, you're not comfortable, but you're alive. And you're not alone. You have your family, your neighbors, your community. And that, you realize, is everything. You recall reading something once. You think it was about a village in Switzerland in the Middle Ages, and it seems they actually tried a lawsuit against some pesky caterpillars that were ruining their crops. They hired a lawyer and presented evidence, all very official and proper. Sadly, the caterpillars lost the case, but they were allowed to relocate somewhere else without any harassment. Maybe you guys should sue the winter. And then there's the ritual of bedtime, a chaotic symphony of shared blankets and whispered stories. Your mother tells a tale of a brave knight and a fire-breathing dragon, her voice soft and soothing. Your younger siblings drift off to sleep, their faces peaceful. Even your father, usually stoic and reserved, cracks a small smile. You listen to the wind howling outside, the snow pelting against the windows. It's a harsh, unforgiving world out there. But inside this small cottage, surrounded by the warmth of your family, you feel safe. For now. You know that winter will continue to test you. There will be more hardships, more challenges, more moments of doubt. But you also know that you're not alone. You have your community, your shared resources, your collective strength. And as long as you have that, you can endure anything. Except maybe Mrs. Abernathy's suspicious fox stole. That thing gives you the creeps. Right, gather round, you lovely bunch of, well, whatever you are. The snow's piling up outside like a disgruntled cat refusing to move from your favorite armchair, and let's be honest, frostbite is not the new black. So, we're hunkering down indoors, aren't we? Trading our shovels for, well, for whatever you can find that isn't buried under a mountain of holiday decorations. You trudge in from the biting wind, cheeks stinging with the cold, and peel off layer upon layer of outerwear. Honestly, you look like a particularly awkward onion. Finally, liberated from your Arctic cocoon, you're ready to face the real challenge, indoor winter projects. And no, I don't mean finally organizing that junk drawer that's become a biohazard. We're talking crafts, tasks, the stuff that keeps you from descending into complete cabin fever madness. First things first, warmth. You stoke the fire, or adjust the thermostat, because let's be real, not all of us are living in a log cabin fantasy, and immediately feel the blessed heat radiating through your frozen bones. This feeling of warmth and security inside while the storm rages outside. Humans have been chasing that feeling for millennia. Think about it, even the earliest hominids, huddled around a flickering fire in a cave, probably felt a little smug about not being mammoth food out in the blizzard. It's primal. Now, with the immediate threat of hypothermia averted, your attention turns to something. Anything. Staring at the wall becomes surprisingly captivating after about an hour, but even that loses its appeal. So, let's talk crafts. You rummage through your supplies, unearthed from the depths of a closet previously only explored by dust bunnies and forgotten birthday presents. Aha! Yarn. The possibilities are endless, or, at least, they feel endless until you remember you only know how to knit a lopsided scarf that ends up looking like a misshapen earthworm. But fear not. Even if your knitting skills are challenged, there are other options. Macrame, for instance. Yes, macrame, the craft of the 70s that refuses to die. Did you know that sailors were some of the earliest adopters of macrame? While stuck on long voyages, they'd use knotting techniques to create everything from decorative items to practical necessities like hammocks. You, on the other hand, are just trying to make a plant hanger that doesn't look like it was attacked by a particularly aggressive spider. As you fumble with the cords, trying to remember which knot goes where, you find yourself wondering about the history of crafts in general. It's fascinating, really. Before mass production, everything was handmade. Every stitch, every carving, every pot, a testament to human ingenuity and skill. And let's be honest, way cooler than anything you can buy from a big box store. You glance at the half-finished macrame abomination in your lap, and reconsider that statement. Crafts aren't just about making pretty things, though. They're about problem solving, about developing fine motor skills, about connecting with a tradition that stretches back to the very beginnings of human civilization. Historians still argue whether the earliest cave paintings were purely artistic expression or served a more practical purpose, like teaching hunting techniques. Maybe your macrame disaster piece is actually a coded message to future generations about the perils of DIY. Okay, maybe not. Moving on. What about that overflowing bookshelf? You know, the one that's slowly turning into a leaning tower of paperbacks? Time for some serious culling. You pull down a dusty volume and crack it open, inhaling that distinct, musty smell of old books. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? A time capsule of stories and ideas. You start sorting, keep, donate, and the dreaded, unsure. The unsure pile quickly rivals the keep pile in size. This is harder than you thought. Each book holds a memory, a fleeting moment in time. You remember where you were when you read it, what you were feeling. A wave of nostalgia washes over you. You stumble upon a first edition copy of Pride and Prejudice. Just kidding. It's probably a mass-market paperback with a coffee stain on the cover. But still, it's a good book. You settle in with a cup of tea and lose yourself in the witty banter and romantic entanglements. Reading, of course, isn't the only intellectual pursuit you can engage in indoors. You could learn a new language. Duolingo is waiting. Or perhaps finally try to understand quantum physics. Though, be warned, attempting to understand quantum physics can lead to existential crises and a sudden urge to dye your hair blue. You've been warned. Alternatively, you could organize that spice rack. I know, it sounds incredibly mundane, but trust me, the satisfaction of knowing exactly where your cumin is located is unparalleled. Plus, you might discover that you have 3 jars of paprika. Don't ask me why. While you're at it, consider organizing your photos. I know, it sounds daunting, especially if you're like me and have thousands upon thousands of digital photos cluttering your hard drive. But think of it as a trip down memory lane. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll cringe at your questionable fashion choices from the early 2000s. The Roman Emperor Nero, known for his, let's say, eccentric behavior, was said to have a penchant for collecting and arranging precious stones. Who are you to judge if you're sorting through photos of your cat? As you sift through the images, you might stumble across old family photos. These are treasures, really. Glimpses into the lives of people you may have never known. You wonder about their stories, their dreams, their struggles. Historians still argue whether photography provides an objective record of the past or is inherently shaped by the photographer's perspective. But regardless of its objectivity, it's still a powerful tool for connecting with our history. Of course, let's not forget the practical tasks. Winter is a great time to tackle those indoor repairs you've been putting off all year. That leaky faucet, the squeaky door hinge, the wobbly bookshelf that threatens to collapse at any moment. Now's the time to fix them. And before you say you're not handy, let me remind you that YouTube exists. You can learn how to fix almost anything with a little patience and a healthy dose of denial about your own ineptitude. You grab your toolbox, which, let's be honest, probably consists of a hammer, a screwdriver, and a roll of duct tape, and approach the leaky faucet with trepidation. You watch a YouTube tutorial, carefully following each step. Things are going surprisingly well, until you accidentally strip the screw. Great! Now you have a bigger problem than you started with. But hey, at least you tried, right? And maybe, just maybe, you learned something in the process. Like, for example, that you should probably call a plumber. As the day wears on, the snow continues to fall outside. The wind howls, rattling the windows. But inside, you're cozy and warm, surrounded by your books, your crafts, and your slightly less leaky faucet. You feel a sense of accomplishment, of having made the most of a dreary winter day. Now, I know what you're thinking, but what about baking? Surely, you're going to talk about baking. And you're right. I almost forgot. Baking is a quintessential winter activity. The smell of cinnamon and spice filling the air, the warmth of the oven radiating through the kitchen, it's pure comfort. You decide to bake a batch of cookies. You pull out your recipe, gather your ingredients, and get to work. Flour dusts the counter, sugar sparkles in the light, and the aroma of vanilla fills the air. Baking, like crafting, is a form of alchemy. You take simple ingredients and transform them into something delicious and beautiful. Ancient Egyptians were known for their elaborate bread-making techniques, using honey and spices to create treats for religious ceremonies. You, on the other hand, are just trying to avoid burning the cookies. As the cookies bake, you can't help but feel a sense of contentment. The simple act of creating something with your own hands is incredibly satisfying. It's a way to connect with your creativity, to express yourself, and to share something delicious with the world, or, just eat them all yourself while binge-watching Netflix. The timer dings, and you pull the cookies out of the oven. They're golden brown and perfectly crispy around the edges. You let them cool for a few minutes before taking a bite. They're delicious. Warm, gooey, and utterly irresistible. You eat another one. And another. Okay, maybe just one more. As the evening draws to a close, you settle in with a book, a cup of tea, and a plate of cookies. The snow is still falling outside, but you don't mind. You're warm, you're cozy, and you're surrounded by the things you love. And as you drift off to sleep, you can't help but feel grateful for the simple pleasures of winter. The chance to slow down, to reconnect with yourself, and to appreciate the warmth and comfort of home. Historians still argue whether winter solstice celebrations originated as a way to ward off the darkness or as a celebration of the return of the light. Maybe it's both. Maybe winter is a time for both introspection and celebration. So, until next time, stay warm, stay cozy, and don't forget to organize that spice rack. You never know when you might need that cumin. Okay, settle in, friend. Just, loosen those shoulders, maybe unfurrow that brow. We're going to take a little trip. Think of it like a mental snow day. Except instead of hot cocoa and cartoons, we're diving into the fascinating, and surprisingly cozy, intersection of faith and winter. Right now, you're probably feeling it, aren't you? That slump. That seasonal shift. The days are short, the nights are long, and the sky seems to have permanently adopted a shade of gray best described as existential dread. Don't worry, it happens to the best of us. Even polar bears probably get a little bummed out sometimes. It's natural. Humans are, at our core, sun worshippers who have grudgingly adapted to, not sun. So, what do? Well, throughout history, when the world outside turns into a frozen wasteland, people have turned inward. And upward. Toward faith. Imagine yourself, if you will, trudging through a snow-covered landscape, wind biting at your cheeks. The year is, say, 1347. You're headed to the local church, the only warm, well-lit place for miles. You're not exactly thrilled. The sermon is probably going to be 2 hours long, in Latin, and feature a lot of finger-wagging about your recent questionable decisions regarding the village blacksmith's daughter and the prize-winning goose. But, there's a sense of community. A shared purpose. A flicker of hope against the encroaching darkness. It's a refuge. This need for solace, for connection, is a pretty universal human thing. And winter, with its inherent challenges, really cranks up the dial on that need. Think about it. Food is scarce. Resources are dwindling. The threat of illness looms large. You're basically living in a medieval survival horror game, only instead of zombies, you've got, well, just as unpleasant things actually. Historically, the church, particularly in medieval Europe, played a crucial role in providing exactly that, refuge. It was the center of the community, providing not just spiritual guidance, but also practical assistance. Remember, monasteries weren't just places for monks to chant and copy manuscripts. They were also agricultural hubs, storehouses of knowledge, and often, the only source of medical care for the surrounding population. But it wasn't just Christianity. In cultures all around the world, winter has always been a time for reflection, for ritual, and for reinforcing social bonds. The winter solstice, that darkest day of the year, has been celebrated for millennia. From the Roman Saturnalia, a festival of feasting and revelry, to the Norse Yule, a time for honoring ancestors and praying for a bountiful harvest, these celebrations were all about acknowledging the power of winter, and finding ways to endure it, together. And maybe drink a bit too much mead in the process. Speaking of Yule, did you know that some historians believe the tradition of decorating a Christmas tree actually originates from pagan winter solstice rituals? The evergreen tree, a symbol of life that endures even in the depths of winter, was often brought indoors and decorated with offerings to appease the spirits. It's like, hey, we acknowledge your power, dark winter gods. Here's a shiny apple. Please don't freeze our crops. Works every time. Maybe. Historians still argue whether these pagan traditions were consciously adopted by early Christians, or whether they simply evolved organically over time. What's not up for debate is that many of our modern winter holidays are a delightful mishmash of ancient beliefs and more recent religious observances. Now, let's switch gears for a second. Let's talk about the Aurora Borealis. The Northern Lights. Have you ever seen them? They're breathtaking. Imagine standing beneath a sky shimmering with emerald and violet, the air crackling with unseen energy. It's like the universe is putting on a light show just for you. For many indigenous cultures in the Arctic regions, the Aurora Borealis isn't just a pretty light show. It's a powerful spiritual phenomenon. Some believe it's the souls of the dead dancing in the sky. Others see it as a bridge between the earthly and spiritual realms. The Inuit, for example, often believed that the aurora was a pathway for souls to ascend to the afterlife. You probably wouldn't whistle at it though. They believe whistling at the lights could summon the spirits closer, which might not be a good thing. Imagine being that guy, oh, look, pretty lights. Whistles loudly, oh no, now there are ghosts. Isn't it amazing how something as simple as a natural phenomenon can inspire such deep spiritual beliefs? It really makes you wonder what future generations will make of our obsession with, I don't know, TikTok dances. Behold, the sacred flailing of the ancestors. They communicated their hopes and dreams through synchronized arm movements. But, back to the cold. Let's consider the perspective of someone living in a harsh, unforgiving climate. Winter isn't just an inconvenience, it's a constant threat to survival. In such circumstances, faith can become a lifeline. A way to make sense of the seemingly random suffering and hardship. Think about the story of Job, from the Hebrew Bible. Job, a righteous man, is subjected to a series of unimaginable trials, losing his possessions, his children, and his health. Throughout it all, he maintains his faith in God, even when he doesn't understand why these things are happening to him. While the story of Job isn't explicitly set during winter, it embodies that sense of enduring hardship with unwavering faith. It speaks to the human need to find meaning and purpose, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but what about those other kinds of winter religions? And by that, I suspect, you mean winter-themed cults. Look, every season has its weirdos. And yes, there are stories, often whispered and sensationalized, of isolated communities engaging in unconventional practices during the winter months. Tales of rituals performed in the dead of night, sacrifices offered to appease winter deities, and, well, let's just say things that probably wouldn't pass the PG-13 rating we're sticking to here. The truth is, separating fact from fiction in these stories can be difficult. Many of these accounts are based on rumors, folklore, and the sometimes exaggerated testimonies of outsiders. But it's also true that throughout history, there have been groups who have interpreted religious texts and practices in ways that are, shall we say, not exactly mainstream. For example, there are whispers, and only whispers, really, of ancient Siberian shamans who believed that winter was a time when the veil between the living and the dead was particularly thin. These shamans were said to perform rituals to communicate with spirits, often involving hallucinogenic mushrooms and questionable animal sacrifices. But, again, these are largely unsubstantiated stories. Like, really unsubstantiated. So take them with a grain of, or maybe a whole shaker of, salt. I did once read a blog about a group in Minnesota who worship a snow golem, but I think that was just performance art. And a cry for help. The point is, while the vast majority of religious practices during winter focus on themes of hope, community, and enduring hardship, there's always going to be a fringe element that takes things in a different direction. That's the thing about belief. It can be a powerful force for good, but it can also be twisted and manipulated. Historians still argue whether these more extreme examples of winter-related religious practices were truly widespread, or simply isolated incidents amplified by fear and superstition. What's certain is that they provide a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, glimpse into the human capacity for both faith and, well, let's just call it creative interpretation. So, where does that leave us? Well, hopefully, a little bit warmer, both literally and figuratively. We've explored how faith, in its many forms, has offered comfort, hope, and a sense of connection during the bleak winter months. From the communal warmth of a medieval church to the awe-inspiring spectacle of the aurora borealis, winter has always been a time for turning inward, for reflecting on our place in the world, and for seeking solace in something greater than ourselves. And for avoiding snow golem worshippers. Maybe, just maybe, this winter, you can find your own source of spiritual solace. Maybe it's as simple as spending time with loved ones, appreciating the beauty of a snow-covered landscape, or simply taking a few moments to breathe and reflect. And if all else fails, you can always try decorating a tree with shiny apples. It couldn't hurt. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's talk about being cold. Like, really cold. Imagine that chill that sneaks into your bones even when you're bundled up inside with a roaring fire. Now strip away the fire, the cozy blanket, the central heating, and replace it with, well, practically nothing. Because that's what it was like for many peasants, particularly during times of hardship. You trudge through the snow, your threadbare tunic doing little to fend off the biting wind. Each gust feels like a tiny ice dagger aimed straight for your vital organs. Your breath plumes out in front of you, a fleeting reminder that you're still alive, still generating some semblance of warmth. The concept of central heating didn't exist, naturally. You might have a hearth, a small fireplace, but fuel was scarce, and heat, well, it was a luxury. You might huddle together with your family, livestock even, for a little shared body heat. Think of it as a very low-budget, pre-industrial communal heating system. This was more than just uncomfortable, it was downright dangerous. And it wasn't just the cold itself. It was the companion it brought along, malnutrition. Picture this, you've been working the fields all day, if working means shivering and flailing with numb fingers, and you return to a meager supper. Perhaps some thin soup, maybe a hunk of stale bread if you're lucky. Meat? That's a special occasion, reserved for lords and maybe, just maybe, a fortunate hunting trip. Forget fresh fruits and vegetables. Those are summer luxuries. What you do get, if you get anything at all, is stored for the winter, slowly decaying, losing even more vitamins with each passing day. Delicious, right? You can almost taste the scurvy already. This combination of cold and malnutrition is a double whammy for your immune system. It weakens your body's defenses, making you an easy target for all sorts of nasty illnesses. Things we consider easily treatable today could be death sentences back then. Pneumonia, for example, was a major killer. Your lungs, already stressed by the cold air and lack of nutrients, become inflamed and filled with fluid. You cough, you wheeze, you struggle to breathe. And without antibiotics, your chances of survival are slim. And then there's frostbite. Oh, frostbite. Imagine your fingers and toes turning white, then blue, then black. The feeling is a strange mix of numbness and excruciating pain. Tissue is literally freezing. And the treatment? Well, there wasn't much. Amputation was sometimes necessary, but even that was a risky procedure in a time before proper sanitation and anesthesia. Historians still argue whether the lack of readily available clean water contributed more to disease than any other single factor. Think about that next time you casually turn on the tap. Hypothermia, too, was a constant threat. Your body temperature drops dangerously low. You shiver uncontrollably, become confused, and eventually lose consciousness. Without intervention, and there wasn't much to intervene with besides more layers, if you had them, or maybe a warm drink, if you really had them, it could be fatal. You drift off into a permanent, icy slumber. Cozy, I guess. These aren't just abstract medical terms, they're the realities of daily life for countless peasants. They're the unseen enemies that stalk the countryside, preying on the weak and vulnerable. And they aren't alone. Because when your body is already weakened by cold and hunger, it becomes susceptible to a whole host of other diseases. Think about the crowded, unsanitary living conditions. Multiple families crammed into a small, poorly ventilated hut. Perfect breeding grounds for germs. Hygiene was lacking, to put it mildly. Bathing was infrequent, if it happened at all. Waste disposal was rudimentary. And clean water? Often a distant dream. Remember, we are talking about a time before plumbing. So basically, the whole village was one giant, germ-filled petri dish. Yum! Diseases like dysentery, caused by contaminated food and water, were rampant. Symptoms included severe diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and dehydration. Not a fun way to spend your day, especially when you need to be out in the fields working. Typhus, spread by lice, was another common killer. It caused fever, headache, and a characteristic rash. And then there was the ever-present threat of infectious diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. These could sweep through a village like wildfire, leaving a trail of death and devastation in their wake. Fun fact, some scholars now believe that a measles outbreak contributed heavily to the downfall of the Roman Empire. See? Even empires couldn't handle the sniffles. So you're cold, you're hungry, and you're surrounded by disease. What do? Well, you keep working. You keep trying to survive. You have no choice. Your life depends on it, and the lives of your family depend on you. You might turn to folk remedies, herbal concoctions passed down through generations. Some might offer a little relief, while others are probably useless, or even harmful. Hey, at least they gave you something to do. It's like the ancient equivalent of WebMD, except instead of doom scrolling, you're grinding up questionable herbs in a stone mortar. And then there's religion. You pray to God, or whatever deity you believe in, for deliverance. You hope for a miracle. You seek comfort in the rituals and traditions of your faith. Sometimes, that's all you have left. After all, hope costs nothing. Except, maybe a candle. Those things weren't cheap. But even in the face of such adversity, people find ways to cope. They find ways to support each other. They share what little they have. They tell stories, sing songs, and celebrate what small joys they can find. Because even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine a simpler, more idyllic life. But the reality for many peasants was one of hardship, suffering, and constant struggle. Cold, malnutrition, and disease were ever-present threats, shaping their lives and determining their fates. The next time you complain about being cold, remember the peasants, huddled around their meager fires, fighting to survive another day. And be grateful for the warmth, the food, and the healthcare that you have. You might not appreciate that now, but trust me, you would if you were stuck in their worn shoes. Or rather, if you had shoes to begin with. You know, I think I'll make some hot chocolate. Want some? I have marshmallows. It's the least I can do after painting such a bleak picture. Although, thinking about it, maybe marshmallows weren't around back then. Alright, forget the marshmallows. I'm not sure I can handle the cognitive dissonance. But still, hot chocolate? No. Well, more for me then. And maybe, just maybe, a little moment of silence for all the people who shivered their way through history without it. And on that somewhat somber note, I think it's time to, wait, never mind. Still got more to say. Turns out, there's a quirky fringe theory that some particularly harsh winters in medieval Europe were actually caused by volcanic eruptions halfway across the world. Basically, a giant volcano would spew ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing temperatures to plummet. Talk about global consequences. It's like a prehistoric version of climate change, only instead of driving SUVs, people were just trying to avoid freezing to death thanks to a rogue volcano they'd never even heard of. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's talk about winter. I know, you're already bundled up, staring out the window at that soul-crushing gray. But trust me, we're going to make this somewhat bearable. We're diving into the riveting world of winter pastimes. Riveting might be an overstatement. More like existentially necessary diversions. You trudge through the snow, the wind biting at any exposed skin. Each step is a mini workout, your breath puffing out in white clouds. You're probably thinking, there has to be something better to do than this. And you're right. Sort of. The options are limited. Imagine you're back in, say, 16th century Europe. No Netflix. No internet. No escape. Your entertainment choices basically boil down to, avoid freezing to death, find food, and, well, anything else is a bonus. Fun. One popular activity, if you could call it that, was ice skating. But not the graceful, triple-axel kind. Think more, clunky, awkward shuffling on sharpened bones strapped to your feet. Yes, bone skates were a thing. They used animal ribs, usually oxen or horses. Talk about a bone-chilling experience. Get it? I'll see myself out. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that sounds vaguely amusing for 5 minutes. What else you got? Well, there were winter festivals. These were often tied to religious holidays like Christmas or pagan traditions celebrating the winter solstice. Expect a lot of feasting, if you had the food, drinking, if you had the mead, and general merrymaking to try and forget about the impending doom of spring never arriving. People might engage in mumming, where they dress up in costumes and go door to door performing short plays or songs. It's like a medieval version of trick-or-treating, except instead of candy, you're hoping for a stale crust of bread. Of course, depending on your social standing, your winter pastimes varied greatly. If you were royalty or nobility, you might indulge in hunting. Picture this, you, bundled in furs, galloping through the snowy woods in pursuit of a hapless deer. Very glamorous. Very expensive. For the average peasant, though, hunting was illegal. Unless you wanted to risk a hefty fine or a stint in the stocks, you were pretty much stuck with indoor activities. And what might those be? Well, there was always spinning and weaving. Essential tasks, sure, but hardly thrilling entertainment. But hey, at least it kept your hands busy and maybe you could crank out a new pair of socks before your toes turned blue. Storytelling was also a big deal. Gathered around the fire, families would share tales of folklore, legends, and maybe even a ghost story or two to really set the mood. You know, really lean into the whole seasonal depression thing. Historians still argue whether these stories were purely for entertainment or served a more practical purpose, like passing down knowledge or reinforcing social norms. It was probably a bit of both, really. And speaking of indoor activities, let's not forget about, procreation. Long winter nights, limited entertainment options, and a desperate need to keep the population going, well, you do the math. I'm just saying, there's a reason why certain months tend to have higher birth rates. Now, for a slightly more quirky winter pastime, let's talk about ice harvesting. Yes, you heard me right. Harvesting ice. Before the advent of refrigeration, ice was a valuable commodity. So, during the winter months, people would cut massive blocks of ice from frozen lakes and rivers and store them in insulated icehouses. Then, throughout the summer, they could use this ice to keep food cold, make refreshing drinks, or even treat fevers. Imagine the sheer backbreaking labor involved. You're essentially fighting the elements to preserve the elements. Another interesting, and slightly macabre, winter activity was the practice of telling the bees. This was a tradition particularly common in England and parts of Europe. When someone in the family died, it was believed that you had to go to the beehives and inform the bees of the death. The belief was that if you didn't tell the bees, they would leave the hive or stop producing honey. It sounds completely bonkers, right? But it shows how deeply ingrained the natural world was in people's lives back then. And hey, who wants to upset a hive of bees after someone just died? It's just bad form. You might be wondering, okay, these are all interesting. But did people ever just, play games? The answer is yes. Games were definitely a part of winter life, although they were often simpler than what we're used to today. Think board games like chess or checkers, card games, or even just simple dice games. These provided a much-needed distraction from the cold and the monotony of winter. And let's be honest, a little bit of friendly competition can really heat things up. Metaphorically, of course. You still need to stoke that fire. But what about something a little more dangerous? Well, there's always curling. Curling has been around since at least the 16th century in Scotland. You know, that sport where you slide heavy stones across the ice and people sweep furiously in front of them? Yeah, that one. It's basically shuffleboard on ice. And it's surprisingly strategic. Plus, there's something inherently satisfying about yelling at your teammates to hurry hard. You can almost feel the winter blues melting away, or maybe that's frostbite setting in, hard to tell. Of course, winter wasn't all fun and games. It was a time of hardship, scarcity, and often, death. Food was limited, fuel was scarce, and diseases spread easily. For many people, just surviving the winter was a victory in itself. Which makes you think about your own struggles, right? That deadline at work, that awkward family dinner, that endless queue at the coffee shop. Suddenly, not so bad, is it? The Little Ice Age is a fascinating, and chilling, pun intended, period of climate history. From roughly the 14th to the mid-19th centuries, Europe and North America experienced significantly colder temperatures than usual. This had a profound impact on everything from agriculture to politics to art. Imagine trying to grow crops when your growing season is cut short by weeks, or even months. Famines became more frequent, and social unrest often followed. Some historians even argue that the Little Ice Age contributed to major historical events like the French Revolution. Talk about a long winter. So, as you sit there, sipping your hot chocolate, or whatever you do to cope, take a moment to appreciate the simple things. The warmth of your home, the abundance of food, the endless stream of entertainment at your fingertips. Because for most of human history, winter was a time of struggle, hardship, and a desperate longing for the return of spring. And maybe, just maybe, knowing that can make this winter a little more bearable. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go put on another layer of socks. And maybe practice my curling shouts. Hurry hard. Get out of the house and shovel, already. That's close enough, right? Stay warm, friends. And try not to get frostbite. Trust me, it's not fun. I know a guy who. Never mind. Sleep tight. Okay, settle in, friend. Let's talk about being landlocked. Specifically, being landlocked in winter. Picture this, you trudge through knee-deep snow. The wind, a malevolent sculptor, chisels at your face with icy daggers. Your breath plumes out in front of you, quickly dissolving into the vast, unforgiving white. Sounds charming, right? Well, not if you need to get somewhere. Not if your village's survival depends on it. Being landlocked, without access to a sea or ocean, isn't just a geographical quirk, it's a way of life. And winter? Winter amplifies everything. Imagine trying to run a supply chain relying on oxen and sleds when the passes are choked with snowdrifts and the temperatures are flirting with the absolute zero mark. You're not just battling the elements, you're fighting against the very fabric of isolation. Think about places like Switzerland. Gorgeous, right? Postcard-perfect mountain villages, chocolate box chalets. But pre-industrial revolution, that idyllic scene was a logistical nightmare come winter. Historically, Switzerland remained neutral, even in times of war, due in part to its geography. Moving armies through those passes in any season, let alone winter, was a strategically unappealing proposition. It's like trying to thread a needle with boxing gloves on. Impractical and likely to end in tears. Now, consider this, you're a medieval merchant trying to get a wagon load of salt to some remote hamlet. Salt, crucial for preserving food, is essentially a lifeline. But the passes are closed. Avalanches are a constant threat. Your oxen are looking at you with that, "Are you sure about this?" glint in their eyes. Do you risk it? Or do you condemn the hamlet to a winter of bland gruel and potential scurvy? The stakes are high, friend. The sensory experience alone is overwhelming. The crunch of snow underfoot, the rasp of wind, the sting of ice crystals against your skin. The visual landscape is dominated by shades of white and gray, broken only by the occasional, defiant evergreen. And the silence? A profound, almost deafening silence that amplifies the sense of isolation. It's like the world has collectively muted itself for the season. And speaking of silence, that reminds me of this joke. What do you call a snowman in July? Puddle. Okay, I'll keep them coming, but let's stick to the subject. Let's jump continents for a minute. Consider, for instance, places in Central Asia, like Kazakhstan. Landlocked, vast, and subject to brutal winters. Historically, these regions relied on nomadic traditions and seasonal migrations. But even nomadic peoples, supremely adapted to harsh conditions, faced immense challenges in winter. Finding grazing land for their herds under meters of snow, navigating treacherous icy plains. It was a constant struggle for survival. And forget about online shopping, it was strictly a "what you have is what you get" situation. One quirky, if slightly disturbing, tidbit involves the practice of snow burials in some extremely cold regions. When death occurred in the dead of winter, and the ground was too frozen to dig, bodies were sometimes temporarily stored in snowdrifts until the spring thaw. Think of it as a really, really cold storage unit. Morbid, I know, but necessity is the mother of all invention, even in death. Now, historians still argue whether the harshness of winter travel significantly impeded cultural exchange and technological advancements in landlocked regions. Some argue that the difficulties fostered innovation and resilience, forcing communities to develop unique coping mechanisms and technologies. Others maintain that the isolation hindered progress, slowing the spread of ideas and limiting access to resources. It's like the eternal debate of nature versus nurture, but with snowshoes and a whole lot more frostbite. Imagine the impact on communication. No internet, no telephones, not even reliable roads. News travels slowly, if at all. Rumors flourish, paranoia festers, and communities become increasingly insular. The world shrinks to the horizon, and the horizon is often obscured by a blizzard. Now, let's think about the impact on trade. If you can't get your goods to market, your economy stagnates. If you can't import essential supplies, your community suffers. The price of basic necessities skyrockets, and scarcity becomes a constant companion. It's a pretty basic supply and demand issue. The supply just happens to be trapped behind a mountain range covered in snow. On a personal level, consider the mental toll of prolonged isolation. The relentless monotony of winter, the lack of sunlight, the constant struggle against the elements. It can wear you down. Seasonal affective disorder, SAD, probably isn't a new phenomenon. While they didn't have fancy names for it back then, winter blues were probably a real thing. It's hard to feel peppy when you haven't seen the sun in weeks and your toes are perpetually numb. Speaking of feeling numb, here's another attempt at humor. Why did the snowman call for a divorce? Because his wife was a flake. Okay, I promise I'll try to do better. But seriously, the impact of winter travel restrictions extended far beyond the purely economic or logistical. It shaped social structures, influenced cultural practices, and even impacted religious beliefs. Communities adapted to their isolation, developing unique traditions and rituals to cope with the challenges of the season. Winter festivals, elaborate storytelling traditions, and close-knit community bonds all serve to combat the isolation and maintain social cohesion. Here's something you might not know. In some landlocked regions, the winter months were actually a time for increased artistic expression. With agricultural activities at a standstill, people had more time to devote to crafts, music, and storytelling. The long nights became opportunities for creative pursuits, and the isolation fostered a unique and introspective artistic sensibility. Think of it as a forced artist's retreat, courtesy of Mother Nature. The reliance on local resources also fostered a deep understanding of the natural environment. Communities developed an intimate knowledge of the local flora and fauna, learning to identify edible plants, track animal movements, and predict weather patterns. This knowledge was essential for survival and was passed down through generations. It's kind of like having a nature documentary living inside your head. And that makes me wonder. Historians still argue whether the increased reliance on local resources ultimately led to greater sustainability in landlocked communities. Some argue that the limited access to external resources forced communities to live within their means, fostering a more sustainable relationship with the environment. Others contend that the pressure to survive in harsh conditions often led to overexploitation of local resources, resulting in long-term environmental damage. It's a classic case of short-term survival versus long-term sustainability. You really start to think about the ingenuity of people, you know. We find ways to deal with whatever we are dealt. Let's be clear. Winter travel in landlocked regions was not just a logistical inconvenience, it was a defining aspect of life. It shaped economies, influenced cultures, and impacted the very fabric of society. It was a constant struggle against the elements, a test of resilience, and a testament to the human spirit's capacity to adapt and endure. One last joke before we go. What do you call a sad strawberry? A blueberry. And with that, you can finally rest, friend. Until the next time. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's talk about something a little frosty. We're not talking about a refreshing milkshake, unfortunately. No, we're wading into the icy waters of economic downturns as they slam into the lives of peasants during the winter. Cozy, right? You trudge through the slushy mud, the wind biting at your exposed cheeks. It's late November, maybe early December, the days are blurring together in a grayish, frozen mush. The last harvest, a meager one at best, feels like a distant memory, a forgotten dream of overflowing baskets and sun-drenched fields. Now, Now you're staring down the long barrel of winter, and that barrel is loaded with hardship. The thing is, for peasants, which, let's be honest, is the vast majority of the population back in, say, medieval Europe or really anywhere dependent on agriculture before modern technologies, winter isn't just a season. It's an economic death grip. You see, everything grinds to a halt. The fields are frozen solid, useless. No planting, no harvesting, no income. You're essentially living off the fat, or, more accurately, the incredibly lean muscle, of the land from the past year, and if that fat ain't there, well, things get dicey. You feel the gnawing in your stomach, a constant reminder of the dwindling food stores. You eye your neighbor's chicken, a plump little thing scratching uselessly at the frozen ground, with a longing that borders on the sinful. Tempting, isn't it? But you resist, knowing that stealing from your neighbor only weakens the entire community. Plus, you really don't want to risk ending up in the stocks. Splintery wood and public shaming? No, thank you. Though, I suppose, in a way, public shaming is the OG YouTube cancellation. Historians still argue whether the Little Ice Age, a period of significant cooling that lasted for several centuries, truly crippled agricultural production across Europe or if it simply exacerbated existing problems. Either way, it certainly didn't help. Imagine trying to grow crops when the growing season is shorter, the weather is more unpredictable, and the earth is perpetually grumpy. Talk about a productivity killer. One slightly bonkers theory suggests that the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, triggered by unusually heavy rains and cold weather, might have been partially caused by volcanic activity releasing sulfur into the atmosphere. So, basically, the ground burped, and everyone starved. Lovely. You pull your thin cloak tighter around you, trying to ward off the encroaching chill. The market, usually bustling with activity, is eerily quiet. A few hardy souls huddle around meager fires, selling what little they have left, a few wilted vegetables, some cracked eggs, maybe a threadbare blanket. You consider trying to sell your old axe, but then you realize you'd need it to chop firewood to survive the winter. Classic catch-22, peasant style. Speaking of firewood, you better hope you've stockpiled enough. Because not only is winter brutal for crops, it's also a fuel-guzzling monster. Keeping your home warm, which, let's be clear, is probably a one-room hut with questionable insulation, requires a constant supply of wood. And gathering wood takes time, energy, and sometimes even puts you at risk of encountering unpleasant woodland creatures. Bears, wolves, grumpy forest trolls, the usual suspects. Oh, and remember those lovely feudal dues you owe to your lord? Yeah, those don't magically disappear just because it's snowing. In fact, some lords even use the winter as an opportunity to squeeze even more out of their already struggling peasantry. Because, you know, nothing says benevolent leadership like demanding extra grain when everyone is starving. We need to start a petition, or something. You watch as a group of children huddle together, shivering. Their faces are pale, their eyes are wide with a hunger that chills you to the bone. You can't help but think about your own family, about whether you'll have enough to see them through the winter. It's a weight that settles heavily on your shoulders, a constant anxiety that gnaws away at your soul. I swear, anxiety is the new black. A quirky little detail, in some parts of Europe, people used to believe that winter was caused by a giant witch who would trap the sun in her icy clutches. To appease her, they would leave offerings of food and drink out in the snow, hoping to persuade her to release the sun and bring back the warmth. Look, I'm not saying it worked, but I also haven't seen any giant witches lately, so. You decide to visit the local church. Maybe a prayer, a moment of quiet contemplation, will offer some solace. But even there, the atmosphere is heavy with worry. The priest, a weary-looking man with perpetually chapped lips, is doing his best to offer comfort, but even he seems to be struggling to maintain hope. After all, faith can only go so far when your stomach is empty. You wonder if things will ever get better. If the spring will ever come. If you'll ever see another bountiful harvest. But as you trudge back to your humble abode, the wind howling in your ears, you know that survival is all that matters right now. Just making it through another day, another week, another month. That's the only goal. You huddle with your family around the meager fire, sharing a thin broth made from whatever scraps you could find. It's not much, but it's enough to keep the hunger at bay for a little while longer. You tell your children stories, tales of brave knights and magical creatures, anything to distract them from the harsh reality of their lives. And that, in a nutshell, is winter for the peasant. A constant struggle against hunger, cold, and despair. A time of immense hardship and uncertainty. A period that tests the limits of human endurance. Fun times, right? But despite all the bleakness, there's also a quiet resilience, a stubborn refusal to give up. A belief that even in the darkest depths of winter, spring will eventually come. And that, my friend, is a hope that even the frostiest economic downturn can't extinguish. Unless, of course, it's a really bad one. Then, all bets are off. Historians still debate the extent to which peasant revolts were triggered by economic hardship during the winter. Did the cold and hunger fuel desperation, pushing people to rise up against their lords? Or were other factors, such as political grievances and religious beliefs, more significant? It's a complicated question with no easy answers. What I can tell you is that I wouldn't want to be a lord during a particularly brutal winter. Just saying. You try to remember a joke. Something, anything, to lighten the mood, even just for a moment. Here's one. Why did the Scarecrow win an award? Because he was outstanding in his field. Okay, maybe not the best joke for a group of starving peasants, but hey, I tried. One fringe idea suggests that some peasants actually benefited from the winter, at least in a limited way. They could, for instance, engage in crafts that didn't rely on agriculture, such as weaving or woodworking. Or they could work as hired laborers for wealthier landowners who needed help with indoor tasks. Of course, this only applied to a small percentage of the population, and even then, the conditions were often harsh. You notice your youngest child coughing, a dry, hacking sound that worries you. Sickness is rampant during the winter, especially among those who are malnourished and living in crowded conditions. You pray that it's just a cold, but you know that it could be something much worse. You consider using some leeches, but honestly, the thought of even more blood loss right now is a bit unappealing. You remember an old folk remedy, a concoction of herbs and spices that your grandmother used to make. You rummage through your meager stores, hoping to find the necessary ingredients. It's a long shot, but you're willing to try anything. After all, hope is a powerful medicine, even if it doesn't always work. I once read about a historical figure who insisted on eating only seasonal food. Sounds virtuous, right? Well, in the winter, his diet basically consisted of turnips and despair. True story. You look out the small window of your hut, watching as the snow falls softly on the frozen landscape. It's a beautiful scene, in a way. But it's also a reminder of the harsh realities of your life. You sigh, and pull the blanket a bit higher. Okay, my friend, I think it's time to wrap things up for now. But remember, even when things are tough, there's always hope. And maybe, just maybe, next winter will be a little bit milder. Good night. Okay, settle in, grab your warmest blanket, and maybe a hot chocolate, extra marshmallows, because let's be real, winter's coming, and it's bringing more than just sparkly snow. We're going to talk about something a little grim. But hey, don't worry, I'll keep it cozy-ish. You trudge through the slush, the biting wind nipping at your exposed cheeks. You can practically feel winter pressing in, can't you? It's not just the shorter days or the frantic Christmas shopping. It's something deeper, something almost primal. A whisper in the wind that reminds you that winter, historically speaking, hasn't always been a jolly, Instagrammable wonderland. More like an increased mortality land. Yeah, I know, cheery stuff. But hear me out. Think about it. Before central heating, before readily available groceries, before, well, basically, before now, winter was a serious contender for the title of most likely to ruin your year. You shiver, pulling your scarf tighter. You can almost smell the wood smoke from ancient hearths, see families huddled together, rationing what little food they had left. It wasn't just about being cold. It was about starvation, disease, and a general lack of options when your crops were buried under a mountain of snow. You squint against the weak sunlight, imagining the sheer desperation of someone facing a long, brutal winter with no resources. People died. A lot of people. Especially the vulnerable, the elderly, the very young, the already sick. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a Darwinian test. You wonder, idly, if your ancestors had to gnaw on tree bark to survive a particularly rough January. Probably not your ancestors, specifically. Maybe some distant, forgotten relative. Someone whose survival ultimately led to you being here, wrapped in a fleece blanket, complaining about the price of avocados. Speaking of which, I just saw avocados for $3 each. I swear, they're trying to kill us, one overpriced guacamole at a time. But back to the somber stuff. One fascinating example of winter's impact on mortality comes from the history of infant abandonment. In many pre-modern societies, newborns, especially girls, were sometimes left outside to die, a practice often euphemistically referred to as exposure. It's a heartbreaking reality, and while it wasn't exclusively a winter phenomenon, the added hardship of the cold undoubtedly made it a more frequent and deadly occurrence during those months. You wince, picturing it. It's not pleasant, is it? But it's important to remember that human history is full of hard choices made in even harder circumstances. And winter, historically speaking, was a master of creating those circumstances. You take a deep breath, the frigid air stinging your lungs. It's not all doom and gloom, though. Humans are remarkably resilient, and winter, ironically, also fostered a strong sense of community. People relied on each other for survival, sharing resources, providing warmth, and offering comfort in the face of adversity. Imagine the stories told around crackling fires, the songs sung to ward off the encroaching darkness, the simple acts of kindness that made all the difference. You pull your gloves out, the touchscreen fabric strangely warm against your skin. Modern life is weird, isn't it? We can order pizza at 3 a.m. while sitting in a heated room, but we still get stressed about finding the perfect holiday gift. Priorities, am I right? But even with all our modern conveniences, the specter of winter mortality hasn't entirely disappeared. The elderly are still more vulnerable to cold weather and respiratory illnesses. Homeless populations face immense challenges in staying warm and safe. And even for those of us with comfortable homes and plenty of food, the winter blues can take a significant toll on our mental and emotional well-being. You glance out the window, noticing the bare branches swaying in the wind. There's a certain stark beauty to it, isn't there? A reminder of the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. You ponder for a moment about how different cultures have dealt with winter. Some societies, like the Inuit, developed incredible adaptations to survive in extreme Arctic conditions, building igloos, hunting seals, and crafting clothing from animal skins. Others, like some ancient European tribes, engaged in elaborate rituals and festivals to appease winter deities and ensure the return of spring. Historians still argue whether these rituals were genuinely believed to have magical power, or if they were simply a way to cope with the psychological strain of the season. You chuckle softly, picturing a group of druids trying to bargain with Jack Frost. Okay, Jack, we'll give you this offering of mead and mistletoe, just please dial down the blizzards, alright? And then there are the slightly more unconventional theories. You know, the ones that pop up in late-night documentaries or on conspiracy theory forums. Things like the idea that certain ancient civilizations disappeared due to a sudden and catastrophic winter event, a hypothetical scenario involving a supervolcano eruption or an asteroid impact that plunged the world into a prolonged period of darkness and cold. You roll your eyes playfully. While there's no solid evidence to support these extreme theories, they do highlight the enduring fear that winter can inspire, a fear rooted in our collective memory of hardship and vulnerability. I once heard a guy at a coffee shop arguing that the Ice Age was actually caused by aliens trying to terraform the Earth. The barista just stared at him. It was beautiful. You take another sip of your imaginary hot chocolate, the warmth spreading through you. It's easy to forget, in our centrally heated world, the sheer power that winter once held over human lives. It shaped our cultures, influenced our religions, and determined the fate of entire communities. You think about the countless lives lost to winter's harsh grip, the stories of resilience and survival, the enduring human spirit that somehow managed to persevere through it all. It's a sobering thought, but also a strangely comforting one. It reminds you that you're part of a long and unbroken chain of ancestors who faced incredible challenges and somehow, against all odds, made it through. You smile slightly, a sense of gratitude washing over you. You're lucky to be here, in this time, with all the comforts and conveniences that your ancestors could only dream of. And while winter may still bring its challenges, you're equipped to face them, not with fear, but with a sense of appreciation for the warmth, the food, and the community that surrounds you. And, maybe with a slightly unhealthy obsession with watching cat videos on YouTube. I mean, hey, coping mechanisms, right? But before you settle in for your cat video marathon, let's touch on one last point. You might think all this winter mortality talk is a relic of the past. And while modern technology has undoubtedly reduced the risks, it hasn't eliminated them entirely. In fact, some studies suggest that winter mortality rates may be rising again in certain parts of the world, due to factors like climate change, energy poverty, and aging populations. You frown slightly. It's a reminder that even in the 21st century, winter can still be a formidable force, and that we need to remain vigilant in protecting the vulnerable and ensuring that everyone has access to the resources they need to stay safe and healthy during the colder months. Like maybe not charging $3 for an avocado. Just a thought. You stretch, feeling a slight twinge in your back from sitting too long. Time to get up and move around, maybe do a few stretches. And definitely time for that cat video marathon. Because, let's be honest, who can resist a fluffy kitten chasing a laser pointer? You yawn, feeling the sleepiness creep in. The room is warm, the blanket is soft, and the thought of snuggling up with a purring cat is incredibly appealing. You think back to all the stories of winter hardship you've just heard, the lives lost, the struggles endured. And you feel a renewed sense of gratitude for the simple comforts of your own life, the warmth, the safety, the abundance of food and resources. You close your eyes, letting the peaceful feeling wash over you. The wind howls outside, but you're safe and warm inside. And as you drift off to sleep, you whisper a silent thank you to all those who came before you, the ones who braved the cold, the hunger, and the darkness, so that you could be here, now, safe and sound. Sweet dreams. Alright, settle in, buttercups. Let's talk about the medieval peasant. You. Yes, you. Imagine trading your ergonomic office chair for, well, basically a dirt floor. Cozy, right? You trudge through the mud, the chill seeping into your threadbare boots. It's dawn, or maybe it's just perpetually overcast, hard to tell the difference these days. Your breath mists in the air as you make your way to the fields. The fields, naturally, don't belong to you. They belong to the lord of the manor, the guy whose biggest hardship today will probably be choosing between boar and venison for dinner. You, on the other hand, will be thrilled if you find a turnip that hasn't been half-eaten by a rabbit. You're probably thinking, ugh, why me? Why couldn't I have been born a knight? At least they get paid to wear shiny metal. Ah, yes, the romantic notion of knighthood. But here's a secret, most knights weren't exactly rolling in dough either. Many were essentially glorified mercenaries, constantly trying to avoid being on the losing side of a battle. Besides, have you ever tried wearing plate armor in July? I'm sweating just thinking about it. You grip your hoe, the wood rough against your calloused hands. Today's task, weeding. Hours and hours of weeding. Backbreaking, mind-numbing weeding. It's enough to make you question your entire existence, but hey, at least it's honest work. And besides, complaining won't fill your belly. You're not alone, though. The field is dotted with other peasants, their faces etched with the same weary resignation. You share a nod with Agnes, whose youngest child is currently battling a mysterious rash, probably just another Tuesday. There's old Thomas, whose back has been giving him trouble ever since he fell off the cart last harvest. And then there's, well, everyone else, all toiling away in the perpetual agricultural grind. Did you know that the average life expectancy for a medieval peasant was around 30 years? Yep, you're practically ancient already. Of course, that number is skewed by infant mortality rates. A lot of babies didn't make it past their first birthday. But still, 30 years. That's less time than it takes to pay off a student loan. And speaking of grim facts, medical practices were, let's just say, experimental. Leeches were involved. Frequently. Historians still argue whether the medieval period was as uniformly bleak as popular imagination makes it. Some point to evidence of thriving communities, vibrant folk traditions, and even moments of joy. Others emphasize the constant threat of famine, disease, and violence. But one thing is certain, survival required a level of grit and determination that would make a modern-day marathon runner weep. You remember hearing about the trespass offering. You have no idea what that means, and truthfully, you don't care. It has no bearing on this day. Your daily concerns include surviving. The sun climbs higher in the sky, beating down on your back. Sweat stings your eyes, and your muscles ache. You pause for a moment, wiping your brow with the back of your hand. A bird chirps merrily in a nearby tree, oblivious to your suffering. Show off. You take a swig of water from your flask, lukewarm and slightly metallic tasting, but better than nothing. And the work continues. Lunch, if you can call it that, is a hunk of stale bread and a bit of cheese, probably made from goat milk. Not exactly a gourmet meal, but it provides enough sustenance to keep you going until sundown. You eat it quickly, knowing that every minute spent resting is a minute less you have to complete your tasks. One quirky tidbit about medieval peasant life, they actually had surprisingly complex social structures. Beyond the obvious hierarchy of lords and serfs, there were guilds, fraternities, and even informal networks of support that helped people navigate the challenges of daily life. They even had village gossip circles. You know, the Middle Ages' original social media. As you work, you think about your family. Your spouse, who is probably busy with their own chores, spinning wool, baking bread, tending to the animals. Your children, who hopefully aren't getting into too much trouble. You dream of a better life for them, a life where they don't have to spend their days toiling in the fields. But dreams are a luxury you can't afford to dwell on for too long. Suddenly, you notice a glint of metal in the distance. Riders. Knights. Oh. You straighten up, trying to look busy. You don't want to attract attention. Encounters with knights rarely end well for peasants. They're either collecting taxes, stealing your already meager earnings, or looking for recruits for the next pointless war. They pass by without incident, thankfully. You let out a sigh of relief and return to your weeding. It's a small victory, but you'll take it. As evening approaches, the sky begins to turn a soft, rosy hue. The air cools, and a gentle breeze rustles through the trees. You finally finish your assigned task, your body aching in every conceivable way. But there's a sense of accomplishment, too. You made it through another day. You survived. You trudge back towards your village, your steps heavy. The village is a collection of small, thatched roof huts, clustered together for warmth and security. Smoke curls from the chimneys, carrying the scent of wood smoke and cooking food. It smells like home. Mainstream historical fact, the three-field system was a revolutionary agricultural technique used in the Middle Ages. One field was planted with crops, another with a different crop, and the third was left fallow to recover its fertility. This allowed for greater crop yields and a more sustainable food supply. Not that you particularly feel that. You arrive at your hut, your stomach rumbling with hunger. Your spouse greets you with a tired smile and a bowl of stew. It's not much, but it's warm and nourishing. You eat in silence, savoring every mouthful. After dinner, you sit by the fire, listening to the crackling flames. Your children gather around you, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. You tell them stories, tales of brave knights and mythical creatures. Stories that offer a brief escape from the harsh realities of their lives. Before sleep, you and your spouse might engage in folk medicine. Herbs, chants, and prayers, all to combat the maladies of the time. One popular fringe practice was to use charms and amulets to ward off evil spirits. Or you just pass out in exhaustion. I wouldn't blame you. As you drift off to sleep, you can't help but feel a sense of gratitude. Despite the hardships, despite the struggles, you have a family, a home, and a purpose. You have endured. You have survived. And tomorrow, you will do it all again. Wind down. The fire crackles softly now, its light dancing on the walls of your humble hut. The world outside fades into a gentle hush, the sounds of the day replaced by the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. You nestle deeper into your straw-filled mattress, the rough fabric surprisingly comforting against your tired body. Let the worries of the field slip away. Let the image of the demanding Lord fade from your mind. Allow the aches and pains to dissolve into the stillness of the night. Your body, weary from the day's labor, begins to relax, each muscle slowly surrendering to the sweet embrace of sleep. The scent of wood smoke lingers in the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of the straw and the subtle fragrance of the herbs your spouse has hung to dry. These familiar scents envelop you, creating a sense of safety and security. You are home. You are safe. You are loved. Close your eyes now, and let your thoughts drift like clouds across the sky. Imagine yourself lying in a field of wildflowers, the sun warming your skin, the gentle breeze caressing your face. Hear the buzzing of bees as they flit from blossom to blossom, collecting nectar. Feel the soft earth beneath you, grounding you, connecting you to the very essence of life. Breathe deeply, and release all tension, all stress, all worry. Let the gentle rhythm of your breath lull you into a state of profound relaxation. You are at peace. You are content. You are ready to surrender to the healing power of sleep. Sleep now, sweet dreams, the warmth of the fire, the gentle hush. You are cared for, you are valued, everything is as it should be. Sleep, sleep, sleep.